thinking about how resilient in the face of climate change could build $100 billion economy, wondering what it takes to turn challenges into opportunities. Pause, think about it with an intentional thought, and consider where we go from here. Stay tuned and hear what Nikita Sheil-Rolle got to say about transforming resilience into economic catalysts, creating economic growth, and innovation. We will dive into Nikita's insights on how the new built environment can shape a sustainable $100 billion economy for the Bahamas.
Something to think about with Dale Happy Knowles. What we think, we become. What we radiate, we attract. What we imagine, we surely can achieve. Let's change the narrative, 242.
Welcome to Something to Think About. Nikita, how are you today?
I'm wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Good, awesome. Man, you look so trippy, you know. all the way there. And I don't know, you mind me saying where you are or
No,
we did
that's
that
fine.
where this? That's
You
fine.
can share.
Okay. So we're all the way across the equator, all the way down there, round the corner by the juju tree, and up by the canap, and we stop by the sapodilla tree. And when we do all our connection, we have BAM! On the screen with us today. Yes. Awesome. Way. So, I'm glad and delighted to have you here as a young person talking with me on this blessed day. I know it's a little early for most people here, in terms of when we come on with the show. But like I said, 8 hours ahead is a long time. Right?
Yes. Thank you for adjusting slightly.
Yes, yeah. So, folks, as you know, welcome and to the 242 and something to think about with Dale Happy Knowles. And what we like you to do is to share. Ask your questions, tell us where you are at, and what we will go from there as we have the honor of introducing and interviewing this lovely person in front of me with a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of credentials, a wealth of warmth that she wants to bring out and cause the Bahamas to grow from strength to strength. And so we want to tap into that today, and hopefully at the end of the day we find new opportunities that we could probably consider what we want to get involved in so that we could improve ourselves and the Bahamas as a whole. And the world, you know, we can't leave out the world. The world can't operate without us, but, you know, yeah. So, we talked about the wealth of your background and knowledge. And if I could just pull out a couple of snippets out of the bio, I would say you're a pioneer in the work in marine education and youth development. You're transforming the environment. You're a founder of the Young Marine Explorers and also the Cat Island Conservation Institute, and which builds climate resilience communities. And so we want to tap into that and also what you think is necessary for us to create this $100 billion economy. I think it's only 2 steps away, but you know, sometimes we gotta break it down for people to see what is happening and how we can participate in our little way and cause it to happen by becoming resilient. Okay? All right. So let's dive into the first question here is, what inspired you to dedicate your life to marine education and youth development?
That's a really good question. I think it really starts when I would say I acknowledged my deep, deep love for the ocean probably when I was about 13. I was working, I had a summer job at one of the local dive shops, and I was on the snorkel boat, and I thought it was the best thing in the world because I was being paid to be in the water and look at
Mm-hmm.
fish with the tourists swimming around, and I was like, I've made it in life.
Mm-hmm.
And but in the same time that I was so excited about being in the ocean and appreciating the ocean, I realized my colleagues, there was just a disconnect. We would throw
Mm-hmm.
our candy wrapper in the ocean, or, like the Clifton Pier oil spill was just
Bill,
ever
okay.
present, still is. We
Mm-hmm.
still work through it, unfortunately. But I just sort of saw the disconnect with how much we as Bahamians depended on the ocean,
Mm-hmm.
but we weren't really taking care of it. And then when I told people I was going off to study marine science, they would be like, and what are you going to do with that? Like, work at Atlantis? What's the point of going off and studying that? And
Mm-hmm.
it just showed at the time we couldn't see ourselves sort of outside of so many of these traditional roles.
Mm-hmm.
And um, so as I dove deeper into just sort of what was happening in the environmental space in the Bahamas, there were things that were happening, but your average person just was not aware, did not have access to it. And
Okay.
so a lot of my initial work was, how do we connect young people so that they even realize like marine science is a pathway? Um, and then also it's just, I kind of realized, as much as we want to focus on the biodiversity and the animals in the ocean, at the end of the day, if we don't deal with the people who live by the animals in the ocean, whether it's the coral reefs or the sharks, the people
Mm-hmm.
whom are both the custodians and the beneficiaries, if we, the people, don't actually understand what we have, we're never going to protect it. And so that became a really big sort of point of realization for me, was that if I actually wanted to save the ocean, protect the coral reefs, you know, we had to deal with the people, because it was the people and our actions that are and still are negatively impacting,
Mm-hmm.
nature, biodiversity, our oceans.
Yeah, and I always say that we have more water than we have land mass, and so I'm thinking that okay, if I'm fighting for survival and to sustain myself, we have better opportunity to go out there and make something of something than stay on this little rock and the other little rocks in the Bahamas to try and compete. But everybody has their own, and like maybe some of the culture background has something to do with why we're not so much out there in the sea as much as some other people, right?
It's, I think it's a really layered reality. So, and I think the generations before us, like my grandfather, my grandfather he used to build boats, build sloops, and would sail from Andros to Nassau with
Mm-hmm.
fish and. I think that generation was much more connected to the ocean in a way, in comparison to like our current generation, just because
Right.
lifestyle has sort of driven us into the capital in a way that we haven't seen historically. Over the years, we were very much like more dispersed on the islands. We worked in a way that we were much closer, I think, connected to the ocean, but
Mm-hmm.
also the vessels that we would use, we built. How many of us
Okay.
are boat builders now?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when we try to get boats now, like the boats that we have to buy are significantly more expensive, and just even the cost of maintaining them, the cost of running them. So there's a barrier to participation in ocean spaces. And that's a lot of the work that I do to try and
Mm-hmm.
counter, because you have both the economic realities, and also you have the realities that, like, so many of us, all of us, I'm sure, have a story where someone was lost to the ocean.
Right.
Our
Yeah.
like grandparents,
Mm-hmm.
parents even have extreme fear about children, grandchildren being by the ocean,
Mm-hmm.
drowning, because people just don't have the skills to save them. So the fears that we have are real. And I think it's something that is directly tied to our colonial history. And I think also healing those traumas is part of us building a new future that's grounded in an ocean-based economy.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, hopefully we could get beyond those fears and tap into our full potential.
Uh-oh. Happy, did I lose you? Hello?
As
Oh,
you're back, I'm back.
okay.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
back.
we
I'm back.
froze for a second, but I'm here.
You okay? You back?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay. I don't know. The two of us went out. I don't know. The little man inside in the internet running around decided he wanted to stop the
Took a
conversation for a
break.
bit. Oh, yeah. He was a little tired. Yeah. So what I was saying is, how does this in your early commitment reflect? Would be done again. What going on?
Okay. I don't know if it's you or if it's me,
It
but
shouldn't be anybody because I think we all have strong
good internet. It's all right. These, it happens even when we think it's good. Um,
signals.
okay, so
Good.
if I think I understand the question,
Mm-hmm.
is how is my early commitment reflect intentional action towards resilience? I think a big part of resilience for us is ensuring that we have the skills to be able to be equitable participants in these new emerging economies. And so a lot of that is grounded in education and capacity building.
Okay.
Our education systems historically trained us for our tourism-based economy, right?
Right.
And that has gotten us to where we are right now as a nation. And I think there's huge opportunity for us to diversify and see ourselves in in the knowledge economy. I'm a huge proponent of the knowledge economy. I think it's a way that we can ensure greater wealth for Bahamians that is less volatile in comparison to the tourism economy, which is extremely dependent on our nearest neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
I think through knowledge, not only does it help us better understand the realities of our island, and also the blue economy is very young, and as
Mm-hmm.
you said it, all we have is ocean. Like, we are
Mm-hmm.
ocean people. As much as we may fight it, like, we are of the ocean. There's some islands you have, it doesn't even matter where you are. You look left, there's ocean. There's right, there's ocean.
Right.
Like, you look down, the floodwaters are coming up because this is what we're faced with now and the realities of climate change. So
Yep. Mm-hmm.
we are so connected to sort of the oceans and the elements, but I think a big part of our resilience, and it's funny because I think sometimes we like to have these big conversations about what resilience looks like. Resilience
Mm-hmm.
looks like money in our bank accounts.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a complex situation
Mm-hmm.
at all. It's having enough financial resources so you can relocate, you can rebuild, you can build back better.
Mm-hmm.
You can protect yourself and your family, get whatever you need, whether it's the plywood or the water. But so many of us just do not have those financial resources. So our ability to bounce back to where we were before the disturbance and or to a better place is extraordinarily difficult in the absence of financial resources. And so I think when we have really practical conversations about resilience, it's how do we improve the economic standing of our people so that we are better prepared? Because the reality is, the tourism the real estate market in the Bahamas is booming,
Yep.
and it's continued to grow. And the majority of the buyers who are buying aren't actually Bahamians,
Yeah.
so there will continue to be people who can afford to live in our country. For me, I think what's really important is that Bahamians can afford to live in our country at a standard of living. And I know you just spoke with Leslie at
Right.
Archer and her
Mm-hmm.
paper about what does it mean to be middle class. I think these are huge conversations when it comes to conversations about resilience, because who are able to, and if you remember Hurricane Matthew a couple of years ago, Albany was able to bounce back, and within days after the hurricane, they had a golf tournament.
Right.
Whereas, and I'm sure if you go down to like Pinewood, there's still homes with like holes in them from Hurricane
Yeah.
Matthew.
Yep.
Right. So it just depends on where you fall in the financial spectrum that supports your ability to bounce back in many ways. Even just, because resilience is holistic. And even if we're talking about resilience on an individual level, your ability to take time and talk to a therapist about what's happening in your life builds your resilience as an individual. Right. But if you don't have that time, you don't have that money, that's a level of resilience you're not able to tap into.
Right.
So, yeah, there's levels to it.
Yeah, and you're only trying to breathe in that scenario versus trying to exhale and have fun and do productive things. You're just trying to actually just stay above the water line, as I say, so you could breathe and what have you. And, all of this is pivoting around what I call the new built environment, right? That's my $100 billion economy built on 5 pillars. Started from my discussions with Michael Digges, who invited me to radio through a previous show and so forth. And that's on sun, sand, seed, digital, and people. And the sun has to do with the renewables, and the sand has to do with what we could get out of the ground in terms of the medicines and whatever else we could do, because we have all unique stuff. And then we have the sea, which we're talking about today. And digital, we know digital is big, and people is always going to be big. Mm-hmm. So each of those, if we say we could just get 20 out of each, we get 100 easy. And we're already at 10, 12, 15 from tourism. Because I don't think finances is as big as it used to be. Right? So, okay. So how does the devastation caused by Hurricane Dorian shape our vision for creating the Cat Island Conservation Institute? Conservation. Why I keep saying that wrong?
That's all right. So the Cat Island Conservation Institute came about through a collective effort through a number of people who acknowledged the need for more research to be done in country driven by Bahamians. When you look at the research entities, the scientific entities that operate in country compared to, if they're Bahamian or if they're an international entity, it's just there's the majority of the research institutes are international. And after Hurricane Dorian, so before Hurricane, I was talking climate change for a really long time, and people just found it annoying. But, Hurricane Dorian was a wake-up call for our people, our government. And so what the Cat Island Conservation Institute seeks to do, we build out our research tracks a bit differently because what we expect of our principal investigators is that they co-create their research project with the local community. And it's based on the understanding that we have to build the capacity in country to engage in science. We need local communities. And of course, I'm from Cat Island, so I am highly aware of the realities in the Family Islands. And what we seek to do is to train community members so that they can become research, like literal line items in research budgets, as a way of like developing a research-based economy for within the local community. And this is important in so many different ways because, how we interpret data that we have matters. And the people who are interpreting that data bring their lived realities, their perspectives to the conversation. And when we don't have enough of our local people involved in the research effort, there's so many gaps that we open ourselves up to. And so for me and for those of us who were part of the effort for establishing the Cat Island Conservation Institute, it was really about how do we ensure that we are making science more democratized, in a country where generally people would say, oh, marine science is for rich white people.
Mm-hmm.
Like how do we dismantle that so that science is actually for everyone, and it's something that we understand that not everyone has done a PhD, and that's okay, and that we can meet people where they are, we can upskill people so that we can leapfrog them into these new industries. And so this is
Right.
really at the heart of how and why we do the work at the Cat Island Conservation Institute.
Right. And when I was talking with Leslie last week, I didn't even think about it in this way, but research, and she said something, but research itself is an ecosystem, right? And so we're not really tapped into that now, but yes, we might not be a PhD or somebody who's going to be driving the research, but players, just like you go to a hotel, you might be the CEO of the hotel, but you either in the food and beverage or housekeeping or whatever, there's always elements that you could get involved with, and most of these research are funded. So,
Of course.
there's opportunities for people to make money there. And I think that's going to be the key. When people see that they can make money, then they might be more encouraged to go
And it's
in that way.
important to note, sorry to cut you off, but
Go
it's
ahead.
important to note that the research economy has been live and well in the Bahamas for 50 plus years.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just that Bahamians have not
Mhm.
been participants in this economy, because you have researchers who come to the Bahamas, whether it's for their research projects, groups of students that come through universities. This, when I talk about the knowledge economy, this is what I mean. Like,
Mhm.
people are paid and compensated very well for their work and their intellectual efforts in these knowledge-based economies. And it's about, the world has been coming and studying the Bahamas for years. It's now time that Bahamians are at the forefront, and we're getting there, but there's still so much that we need to do. And it's now about not letting it be the elite Bahamians who are the ones having access to higher education and this knowledge economy, but making it so that it's more of the collective.
Yeah. And we share a university in the U. And when I first went there to play ball, uh, I met some people and they were telling me about what they do on weekends and stuff. And I'm like, where? In the Bahamas? Not the Bahamas. Like I'm doing research and talk about the sharks and the this and the that. And that's where I got this idea about the shark being a $2 billion industry, because it's those same people who told me that right
Mhm.
now the industry is close to that, if not more by now. But we in the Bahamas are not tapping into that. Everybody else is tapping into it, but not us. And so, I look forward to all of these things materializing so that we could become more empowered to be independent in terms of not having to always be subservient to somebody for the
Mhm.
mighty dollar. So, what lessons can other communities learn from your response just now?
Um, well, so I think the first thing is that we get to be open to new things and learning new things, which sometimes can be scary. And I
Mm-hmm.
think also in our society where we have different levels of just academics because of our history, because of our education system. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the more that we can remove shame with
Mm-hmm.
where people are,
Mm-hmm.
so it's just like, where it doesn't matter, like, but we just need to meet you where you are. And I think the more that we can cultivate spaces that are safe spaces for lifelong learning for people of all ages, whether you are, it doesn't matter, because we all have things that we have to
Mm-hmm.
learn. And especially when it comes to building more climate resilient communities, this requires implementing, installing technologies, and just doing things differently. And that requires learning, all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think um, something that we have to prioritize as a people is just really being intentional and being kind to each other about supporting our collective learnings. and then helping people get what they need so that they can be more equitably engaged. Because a lot of the times that, scientists come in, there's an imbalance of power.
Right.
And that can have to do with like me as a researcher spent years studying a topic, and then I drop into your community and then I ask you to provide insights, but like you've only been thinking about this for the 30 minutes I have been sitting in front of you.
Right.
So these type of like imbalances that I think sometimes we don't think about matter. And that a big part of that goes back to just our basic literacy and numeracy as a people. Like this is something, and Leslie talked about it in your call. She talked about how there are these gaps in data that when you look at
Right.
like, whatever World Bank like global statistics, the Bahamas isn't always there. And sometimes when we do have statistics, they're not truly reflective of our reality. And that does us a greater disservice,
Right. Right.
because if we say that, yeah, we have 98% literacy, but do we though?
Right.
And if we don't, does saying that we have 98% literacy actually help us as a people? It doesn't,
Right.
because
Right.
in any way, whether because it's the investors who come in who get really frustrated when they can't find, the staff that they need, but it's also the
Mm-hmm.
Bahamian business owner who needs to be able, like who needs a solid team and has to spend so much time upskilling and. So, I think what communities can learn, I think we have to just create safe spaces for learning and upskilling our people.
Yeah. And on that also, not to go that far on the side, but so I believe sometimes the HR systems, we look out for our friends and stuff more so than the person who is merited, and so then they're pushed aside kind of thing, and then they just discourage and get into all kind of other stuff that they probably don't need to get into. Just breathe, as we say.
Yeah.
So growing up in the Bahamas, how did your personal experiences shape your aspiration for resilience and sustainability? And
That's a
then
good
we
question.
crossover.
Um, I mean, it's the reason why I care about this stuff. And I
Mm-hmm.
think if I grew up in the Bahamas, and I mean, I think that's probably why a lot of the world is disconnected about, the urgency for climate adaptation, is that they're not confronted with the realities every day.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, science is a pathway for us to build resilience. And I think it's a very stark contrast on how I see science and resilience and how, other people may view it, because for me, science is about our survival. It's about how do we better tell our story so
Mm-hmm.
that we can get the financial resources that we need, so that we ensure that like the efforts that we're doing to build resilient and sustainable communities are actually in our favor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so living through hurricane after hurricane, just seeing the realities, and it's just also it's the finances. It's not sustainable financially for our people. There's only 400,000 of us. We're not
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people, and the debt that we get from all of these, whether it's a hurricane
Hurricanes, yeah.
here, a flooding
Mm-hmm.
there,
Mm-hmm.
roads washed out over there, like it's just too expensive. We cannot sustain it. And what we are doing is, we are personally paying for the impacts, the climate impacts that we didn't create.
Right.
And so it was that injustice that's really, I think, fueled a lot of my commitment to education, ocean science, technology transfer, just because in order for us to have a fighting chance as a people, I think we need to do a better job at telling our story. And I think that requires, strong research and data that then provides insights that are truly reflective of the people in Mayaguana, in Cat Island, in Acklands, and of course, New Providence.
Cool, cool, cool. So, folks, you're watching something to think about with Dale Happy Knowles, and we have Nikita Sheil-Rolle here with us today, and we're talking about in the blue economy and about how we can make resilience turn into economic growth and development. in many different forums. We want to encourage you to answer your questions, and we'll endeavor to answer them. Well, she will endeavor because I'm not an expert in the blue economy at all. I might think about it, learn from people, but I won't profess to know. I know what you know, right? So, in the context of climate change, what does resilience mean for small island states like the Bahamas?
Right. So I think before I answer that, it's important for
Okay.
us to define resilience.
Mm-hmm.
And resilience is after there's been a disturbance, right? Resilience is your ability to bounce back to where you were prior to that disturbance. And now I think it's important for us to think about, because as a country, we're not necessarily where we even want to be when the hurricane hits us.
Right.
Like a lot of our islands, we still don't have running water. Airports are being constructed, roads, infrastructure, and. So as
Mm-hmm.
a country, we're not even where we truly want to be. But resilience is the mark that looks at after something happens, and it can be at a personal level, it can be a national level. How quickly do we bounce back? And I think what impacts our ability to bounce back is a lot of it. And I always go back to education, because we need to be educating people for the future that we're faced with. And I think that requires us to dive deeper into STEAM, science, technology, engineering,
Mm-hmm.
art, and math, in a way that we haven't seen. And I saw that the Prime Minister just had a proclamation on STEM, which I celebrate. I'm a big proponent of both of STEM plus the arts, so STEAM,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
because I think we have to reach all learners in different ways, and people learn differently.
Right.
Um, but so what does resilience mean for us? It means that we invest so heavily in education so that we are prepared and we have the
Right.
skill set for new industries. And also that I think we also have to reimagine what prosperity for Bahamians looks like, because that is also tied to our resilience. And I think a big part of that is us rewriting our destiny. I think we have such comfort in the tourism industry because it's what we've done for so long, that it's really easy when we talk about diversification, we just diversify segments of the tourism industry
Tourism industry. Yeah.
as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to, like, we diversify down as opposed to out.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this is something that we, over the next decade, we have to be extraordinarily intentional about, because, tourism, while it's great, there's an underbelly to it. And also the reality is most Bahamians do not own the tourism industry that
Right.
we promote. So it's not generating wealth for Bahamians. And unless and until we are generating real wealth for Bahamians, this conversation of resilience will always be like, because of how do you rebuild if you can't buy what you need to rebuild? You don't.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then when you have to migrate, then what? You're
Yeah.
traveling to another country with no resources. Not
Yeah.
good.
So I believe we stick with the tourism is because we haven't scratched the surface of tourism, even though it's 60% of our GDP, etc., and all of that. What we can be getting out of tourism, we not even scratch the surface. But I agree with you, we have to go beyond just tourism also, and so forth. And so when we talk resilience, in my mind, I believe we are always talking also the feasibility to bounce back kind of ability to be able to do that without, like you mentioned just now, putting ourselves in even greater debt. Because if we prepare ourselves properly, then that turnaround time, that reconstruction time should be more feasibly done, more economically done, more efficiently done, and so forth. And so hopefully all of that is a part of the picture that we could get to this $100 billion economy. I will keep putting that in your head, folks. When y'all see, y'all will laugh at me now, but later on you can say, oh, the man was talking sense. You know. and so forth. Okay, so how can resilience act as both a protective measure and a catalyst for growth?
Mm.
Yeah, you're a doctor, so we gotta keep going up the bar.
I'm not a doctor, actually. I have a master's, but I don't have a
Master's, then,
PhD.
sorry, I should say that.
Yeah. No, but I think this is a good question. So I always, there is nothing like a good crisis to birth opportunity,
Mm-hmm.
and when you look at the innovations that move the world forward, and the times when these things were born, even think about COVID. There were so many different industries, career paths that came about because of just COVID forced us to look at things differently. And I think that's what the climate crisis is requesting of us to do, is that we have to look at things differently. But where there are challenges, this is where innovation is born. This is where opportunity is created. And sometimes people don't understand you generally when you are innovating and you're creating something new. It's hard for people to buy in the beginning because it's scary, it's different. They don't really have a lot of faith in it. But you have to do,
Mm-hmm.
and then you create it, right? And I think those who have vision, it's so important for us to be the ones who really lean into that vision, especially at this intersection of crisis and opportunity, because this is where these new ideas that will transform our country and the world are born.
Yeah, I was supposed to put that code up at the beginning, and with different things happening, I totally forgot. But just it talks about in the middle of the difficulties lies opportunity, and you just opened the door for me to bring that back in, which is good.
Brilliant.
Yes, awesome, cool. All right, so we're building up this case, people, and hopefully at the end of the day, you can see it and you'll buy into it, and you'll know that we could do this for all of our economies, the green, blue, purple, yellow, whatever colors. But once we go fundamentally through them and see, but I particularly like the blue economy because, like I said before, we have so much blue. Well, turquoise in our case, but yeah,
Shades of blue.
shades of blue. Yeah, actually, and they're pretty too. And
Yeah.
that picture was one from Cat Island in the background. Also. So, what specific actions can individuals and communities take today to protect themselves and become more resilient in the face of rising climate changes?
Hmm. So I'm going to share a project that I'm working on
Okay.
that is a way that we can answer this question. I think there's many things that we can do, but one of the projects that we're working on now, and again, it goes back to the absence of data.
Mm-hmm.
In the absence of data, we don't know how rain patterns are shifting, and that means that as rain patterns shift, for example,
Mm-hmm.
you end up having droughts in some places, you have floods in others. Actually, I think representatives of the Ministry of Environment are now at there's a conference of the parties on desertification right now happening,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is essentially what happens when there's no water and there's just you just have deserts forming,
Right,
essentially drought,
right.
right? Extreme drought. So one of the things that we're working on with the Cat Island Conservation Institute is working with communities to install different types of technology. So that includes, for example, like weather stations or ocean observation buoys. So these are like pieces of technology that collect certain data points, whether it's about weather, barometric pressure,
Mm-hmm.
rainfall, wave height, parameters in the ocean. Um, and these data points not only will then be able to support our different departments that require that information, but also help us make better information. So one of the things that we're seeking to do is work with community members to become custodians of this technology, right? So you learn how to use the technology, you learn how to maintain it, but then you also learn to understand what the information, the data is even just feeding out and how that relates to us. And this is a more layered way to engage a community, but I think it's extremely critical because in a country like ours that just spans so much area and we have so much water, which means even when it rains in the Bahamas, it doesn't always rain on land, right?
Right,
Like it
right,
can be raining in the ocean, which helps. I mean, but does it really help the farmer? No. So the better that we can understand how things are shifting, whether it's rain patterns, whether it is sort of like same thing with like wave heights. If fishers are able to predict and know what the wave height is on the other side of the island, they can save gas. It also reduces the risk of them being out in rougher weather that can be both damaging to them and then also just prevent them from having a successful fishing day. So I think there's ways that we can, as communities and through partnerships, so often and I think this comes from our colonial history, we always depend on, well, government needs to do this, government needs to do that. The reality is, government is a reflection of us.
yeah,
And so, and they are there to govern, so I think we also, as the people, the citizenry, have a huge responsibility of learning how we can work with our government better and shifting away from the handout, because
right,
that's not going to get us where we need to go. That's
yeah.
that's a very colonial way of being, and it's gotten us to where we are, but we need to pivot.
Yeah. So to use a basketball thing, that will only help you shoot layups. That's not going to teach you how to do hook shots or three pointers or dunks or whatever else it is, right? And so this question here, you just touched on proactive mode. So let's spin the question a little bit. Would have been to say that, okay, for that type of proactivity, how do we then now use that type of example to help people to change from being reactionary? Because, we tend to like to be reactionary. We've been knowing about these hurricanes from 1926 or before. And they kept growing and growing. And my uncle used to tell us this is going to happen, Dorian is going to happen. And he's not an outspoken person, but when I say things to people, you don't know nothing about a hurricane, so who's going to be listening to you? So how do we build up that capacity in the country so that people will start becoming more proactive than reactive?
It's an important question. And I think what we have to remember is being proactive is grounded on the understanding that as an individual, I can make a difference, right? So we are grounded in our belief in self, our belief in our ability to contribute to creating, a different outcome. When we are reactive, and reaction happens for many reasons, right? Like when you're in crisis mode and you're just struggling to keep your head above water, it's very difficult to be proactive.
Yeah,
Proactivity requires a certain degree of time and pause to plan and prepare. But if you are in crisis mode, it's very difficult for you to plan for the future. And so I think there's this need for us to shift out of this, like the house is burning, we are in crisis mode. And that goes from everywhere, from an individual level, the family, our government, in all the ways. It and the thing is, not everyone is able to be in that state to vision, right? Because I think
okay.
there's a big thing about being proactive means that you have to be able to see a different future. And that can be a privilege. The ability to vision and see something beyond where we are and beyond the chaos that we're in is not something that everyone can see at the same time. And I think we have to acknowledge that, because part of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs talks
Right.
about like our basic needs. And so I think in order for us to become a more of a proactive society, it requires more people in our country to have our basic needs met, because then you have more time to pause, or you can redirect some of your brain energy into creating something new other than just surviving. How am I going to do this? How am I going to do
Right.
that?
Cool. Now, folks, just remember now, you just heard it. Nikita said you have to pause, think about it with intentional thought, and then consider where we go from here. You have to do all of that to be successful. Just remember it. All right. Thought you'd like that chuckle. But okay, so how does resilience translate into more productive and optimized environments for economic growth?
So what I love about being from an island is that our realities are so compounded. I think when you live in some of these bigger countries, it's really, even though we do like silos, like our government structures is very siloed, our realities are not siloed, right? Like we are just like, we're just conch salad. Everything is together.
Yep.
You can't separate it even if you tried. And I think that understanding is, I think, incredibly important for us, because it means that we have to look at things holistically for our future. And I think when, again, resilience is our ability to bounce back better, right? And so we want to be able to shift our realities from that of survival into thriving. And so I think and let me take you into the ocean, for this example. Coral reefs that have a healthy coral reef has many different coral species. And sometimes some of those species serve the same function, right? But so you have redundancies in the ecosystem. And so resilient communities have these redundancies. We're not a monolith, right? You're not expecting one source of income to carry us. But I think a more resilient economy is an economy that is greater diversified. So we have more sources of revenue coming in from different places. In the same way, when our environment is healthier, it means our coastlines are better protected, which means when the storm comes, there's less of an economic outlay to restore the roads or rebuild. But the reality is that resilience is a long-term game, and it means doing a lot of work up front that sometimes you don't see until decades later. And that's kind of the trick, because people aren't really keen on delayed gratification. But building resilient communities is because even when it comes to education, you're educating someone today and they're going to be the leaders in a decade, right? Or in 2 decades. So what we do now is going to be so important, because the climate impacts are just going to get worse around the world. And what we're going to see, we've already seen that the world is not really interested in funding the adaptation needs that small island developing states, least developed countries have. But as the climate impacts intensify in other places in the world, that means there's going to be less resources and less attention on us. And I think this is something that we have to be, like being the first and being on the front line of the climate crisis happens until like the climate crisis takes over, and then, the front line shifts.
Yeah.
Because everyone's been taken out. And so our job is to not be taken out. And I think that means that we have to be extraordinarily intentional about how we are building our communities, building our networks. And it goes beyond just, I really wish that we could see ourselves beyond tourism. Tourism will always be there. Like the Bahamas, I have been around the world. There's
Mm,
nowhere that has better beaches than us. Like the
yeah.
Bahamas, there's like it's better in the Bahamas. It is true. And I think we can do a lot more to drive and improve quality of life for Bahamians beyond the tourism sector.
Food. All right, just a little touch on government, and that you mentioned government just now. Because I get 50,000 questions, and I know I can't ask all those questions. But what policies and initiatives do we believe are essential to foster resilience and support sustainable economic development?
Awesome. So policy is so important, and I saw you had a really in-depth conversation. Was it last week about policy? And the thing is that policy is for the future, right? Policies are to ensure that we see this long-term change. And so when it comes to about like how we reform our education policies, what education looks like, even, the Land Reform Act. Right now, I
Right,
think the Attorney General is leading the process for the land reform. This is a hugely important thing that I hope that Bahamians were paying attention to. Land is how we will be able to build wealth. This
right.
is something that I've learned over the past few years as I've really been, I'm a licensed real estate agent with H.G. Christie, and I'm realizing how important it is for us to think about our future. And I think our economy, our tourism dependent realities have us we live paycheck to paycheck. We have we like nice things. We're very close to the United States and Western influence, so we want to try and emulate certain lifestyles, although we don't have the same credit realities, and economic structures as some of these other countries do, which is something that I don't think often think about.
Right.
Um,
We take it for granted.
yeah, we definitely do. Um, and I'm just saying this because I think while we have so many privileges as Bahamians in ways that we may be oblivious to because we haven't seen ourselves in contrast to other realities, there's also a lot that we have access to, but that we don't really value. And I'm going to bring it back to education. Like Bahamians have access to education in a way that other people in other countries dream about. And yet, so many of us, even though we do have access to education, it's not a priority for us. It's not a priority in the family unit, and education is the foundation of everything. And what we run the risk of is that if we are not well informed, there's the conversations that are taking place globally that are taking place, and they're talking about our realities, financial and otherwise. But if we're not at the table and if we don't actually understand what's happening, major decisions are being made about our future that we're oblivious to. And I think
Yep.
this is something that is important for us to become more aware about, because especially in a climate space, as the debt mounts, someone has to pay for that debt. And so it's going to be my generation and the next generation who's going to be carrying this ridiculous debt as a country. Because it doesn't
Yeah.
just we have to. I think sometimes we're disconnected, and even with water, most Bahamians, I believe, don't even realize how water insecure we are, because 90% of our water is made from reverse osmosis, which requires electricity. So the minute we lose electricity, it means we have no water, right? But
Yep.
I think we don't think about that because you turn on your water and water flows.
Or we throw
While
it
some
away.
communities do still have pumps, and people do, like many communities at Nassau and Family Islands, don't have running water, but a lot of us, have had access to running water without really thinking about it, but also being oblivious to the fact that where does our water come from?
Right.
We have rainwater, and then there's the salt water that we extract the salt from. and we use. But so are the privileges that we have become so accustomed to are also on a very fine line of also, just high risk in many ways.
Yeah. So, how can the energy of young people be harnessed? I don't like the word harness, but anyway, to create innovative solutions for climate and economic change challenges.
Young people are powerful because not only are they passionate, but they also believe in a reality, and they're not interested in you saying no, it's not possible, because they can see something that we can't. And so I think that's the type of innovation, the ingenuity that we need. I think we also really need to support young people, but then also expose our young people so that they see themselves outside of just our island, outside of just New Providence centricness, but also really understand our realities within a global context, because
Mm-hmm.
we're living in a global society. Climate change is a global issue. None of these issues that we have, whether it's challenges with the ocean, biodiversity loss, none of it is Bahamian only, right? And a lot
Yeah.
of the reasons why we're struggling are because of external impacts. So the better that we are at articulating our realities to the global community, and I think this is something that young people do really well. But I think it's also important that we expose our young people so that they're not just sharing a very narrow understanding of
Right.
our truth, but that they really do see themselves within a global context.
Yeah. So I see young people as having energy and having the innovative spirit. And so when we look at the innovative spirit, then what innovative solutions do you see as game changers in linking resilience with economic growth?
Yeah. Um, so I'm not going to speak. Well, I'm going to talk about another project that I'm working on,
Okay.
because this way I can ground it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the Cat Island Conservation Institute is a research institute. Much like, Leslie would have said, research hasn't really been a huge priority in our country until fairly recently. So
Right.
what that means is, well, we don't necessarily have all the scientific technologies that we require to be able to advance the work in country. And this has left us very dependent on support from international partners. So one of the solutions that we have come up with at the Cat Island Conservation Institute to counter the fact that, I need a research lab, but I don't have a research lab in Cat Island. How am I going to get a research lab?
Right.
And how do I ensure that when we do marine science activities, we do it safely? Well, we have a team that's building what we're calling a modular laboratory system. So essentially, it is a research lab and a dive locker. So everything you need for scuba diving in a 20-foot container. And so it means that it's accessible. You can put it on a mailboat. It's got wheels, so it can be dragged by a truck. So, these type of innovations, and especially with, technology right now, I think if we really lean into the benefits of technology, it can help transform, because what that modular lab has in it, for example, are these ocean observation buoys that
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Bethel from UB is really keen on having access to, so he can study wave energy. And, then we can ask the question, is it possible that an island like Cat Island could be powered by wave energy?
Yep.
Possibly, right? But how
Mm-hmm.
do we know that? Well, we actually have to do the
The
science to
test. Yeah.
demonstrate that. So I think there's huge innovation, and something like that, as simple as, is it possible that every 6 hours as the tide switches, it's producing enough electrical current to support our homes? Yeah, well, there's not a lot of people on Cat Island, so possibly we could. And, we may find out that there's huge capacity to power,
Mm-hmm.
our islands. And that means now you don't need fossil fuels and things like that.
Right. Mm-hmm. Cool. So now when we look at all of this then, and we have the question on the table, and I'll ask the question slightly different in terms of what does the blue economy need to turn challenges into opportunities?
Hmm. So the reality is the blue economy, the ocean science space is one of the most underfunded sectors right now
Wow.
globally. Yeah, which is wild. I think what we're going to see is a big boom in a few years.
Okay.
Which is why there's like if you're in certain ocean science spaces, there's huge
Sorry, not to cut you off, but I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, space, way out there, it costs so much to get to, have so much funding, and blue, big blue, don't?
yeah, only 5% of the ocean has been explored. So and more money gets invested into space research than ocean research, and it's one of the biggest like I think on a global level, like even at the most recent UN climate change meetings, everyone in ocean science just talks about how there's a dearth of financing for ocean science, and then the funding that does exist, very rarely gets down to us.
Okay.
So I think a lot of it has to do with because the ocean is so unknown, and you said it, we know more about space than we know about the ocean. And as Bahamians, because we have like 98% ocean, you know, it's something that I think, really need to be cognizant of, because we have a lot of ocean and people are fighting to access our ocean, to study our ocean, and most of us haven't even put our ankles in the water for the year. It's about to be the next year coming, right?
Right?
So I think so there's a reality that there's limited financing, and there's also the reality, and I think this has a lot to do with why is the ocean space is very expensive, especially if you're doing things safely. Ask any fisherman, like they will tell you. And so there is high startup costs initially in a lot of these ocean science spaces, which I think kind of makes people a bit more hesitant to invest in them. But I think this is also where innovation comes in, and us being able to, just like our modular laboratory system, that is a direct product of, I wanted something much more. I wanted $1 million lab. I couldn't get that. And I was like, okay, what can I do with 100,000?
Right.
And so innovation and crisis, as we talked about before, breeds opportunity, breeds this reality that we have to figure it out. And I mean, there's nothing to, I think, inspire action like truly survival. Like for me, when I talk ocean science, I'm not talking about, oh, I'd love to discover a new fish.
Right.
I'm saying, like, no, I need us to figure out what we need to do so that we don't die next year.
Right.
Like I think this is sort of the intersection that we're in.
Yeah. Cool. Wow. So when we look at that then, and then we add to the point, then we say then, how do we translate this resilience into economic growth? We talk about all of these different things, what we need and so forth. Do we have a master plan? Do we? What? I mean, I'm saying the proprietary ones. No, let's keep that where they need to be. But as a country, do we have a plan? Do we look at these things and say, oh, these just some young people on the side doing something, let's just give them a couple of dollars and keep them occupied? Do we really believe as a country that we could make a difference?
I think we have a long way to go. I think we are making slow progress, but we don't have a national development plan that we have collectively agreed upon. The 400,000 of us, and just to put things into perspective, the African Union has what they called Agenda 2063. I'm bringing up the African Union because in 2012, I think it was, or 2016, somewhere like that, they acknowledged the diaspora as the sixth region of Africa, right? So that means that plan, Agenda 2063, is also a plan that includes us. So there are people who are thinking, like the entire African continent is thinking about 2063, and they have
Right.
written plans that young people's youth organizations, everything is funneling towards the advancement of that shared vision that the continent shares. And we, as 400,000 people, cannot agree on a shared vision for ourselves. So
Mm-hmm.
I think this is something that is extraordinarily challenging, and I think it's going to be what's going to make or break us. Like, we need to
Right.
agree on a shared vision, and we cannot do this political back and forth because it doesn't make sense.
Right. Right. Right.
And it doesn't help anyone, even though you're giving your cousin's daughter a job today. If it sets us collectively back, as a people, it's not of service. And I think that shared national vision, it shouldn't be so difficult, regardless of the governance and who's governing. We should be able to agree on a shared vision for prosperity for our people. And if we don't do that, what will end up happening is that the highest bidder, the developer who comes in with the most money, always wins. And you know
Mm-hmm.
what often ends up happening? The developer who comes in with the most money doesn't always have our best interest at heart.
Right. Right.
And this is what we've seen time and time again, is that we will say yes because there's jobs promised, jobs that do not build wealth for our people, jobs that are dependent on developments that destroy our natural resources and that create a false reality that is the Bahamas that we sell as paradise. But we need to be intentional,
Right.
on
Right.
what we're doing and what we want for ourselves and the generations that come after us.
Yes. And so when we look at it all, then, so in this space that we talk about today, we could create opportunities with the help of private sector and investors and what have you to do what they need to do to help people like yourself go forward and build the economy the way we need to build it. And more people will come in there so they'll get either jobs or become entrepreneurs in the space themselves. And so when we look at all of that, right? And then we look at right now, when we go 5 and out, so change of government, we waste more money in that change than what we could have been spending or focusing on this. Then, so if we get all that together, then what will be the vision as to what you think we can achieve in terms of expanding the opportunities to build wealth in the country for the Bahamian citizens in particular?
I think there's huge opportunity, and I think it goes back to the fact that there's only 400,000 of us. So we should be able to cultivate a standard of living for our people that is extraordinarily high
Mm-hmm.
holistically, you know, um, because when you think about how much money moves through the Bahamas, and then you think about the few people that make up the Bahamian citizenry, I think there's a way to reimagine what our prosperity and our future looks like. For me, I want to see a Bahamas that has Bahamians that are, well educated and that we're speaking different African languages in addition
Mm-hmm.
to Spanish and French, but that we are able to move through this world beyond the Western world. We're able to, those of us, heal the colonial wounds that we have, that we're not like oblivious to, that, are in our way, that we don't have the gang violence
Mm-hmm.
and femicide taking place. Our communities are too small, and the reality is most of us are related. Like, I'm sure, Happy, if I ask you a couple questions, we'll find out that you're my cousin. You know? So it's just, we are too small,
Mm-hmm.
and there is just too much opportunity for us to waste it. And I think the ocean economy, ocean sciences, like, every single Bahamian needs to be a swimmer, needs to know how to scuba dive, needs to know how to sail a boat.
Mm-hmm.
Like, these are things, like, we need to be boat people and go back to what does it, so that you're bouncing between Cat Island and Exuma and you're not even thinking about it. Why are we going through Nassau to get to Exuma from Cat
Right.
Island? Like, so Can we reimagine how we move? Can we see ourselves as ocean people as opposed to island people? And that we actually understand that it's not just the islands, but it's the entire exclusive economic zone that makes up the Bahamas, and that is actually
Right.
our Bahamian territories. And you know, and can we imagine a country that maybe we have hospital ships, because that makes more sense than building hospitals in flood zones, you know? Like maybe we have a new method of like
Mm.
moving people around, whether it's a ferry system
See, you
subsidized
getting
or
into
otherwise.
my book of ideas that was squashed. But anyway, so
Hey,
like I
that means
said,
they're
that
still living.
hospital ships will not work in the Bahamas. I was told that by two governments. But anyway,
Why?
um, let me go through that right now. But
It's because money was people wanted money. That's why, because
mm,
construction contracts were required. Hospital ships would be a brilliant
yeah.
solution.
Well, I was only looking at it from a point of view, from an emergency point of view, and what have you. And then we had COVID a couple of years later. So anyhow,
Yeah, it's all right.
cool. Yes. All right. So I've asked you a number of questions, and maybe have 50,000 more to ask. Because as you talk, I think of more questions. But what haven't we covered that you would like to share with the people out there or elaborate on?
All right. Um, so I think it is important for us to really expand, um to dive deeper than what we've been taught in school. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and even when you're looking at history, you know, we've been taught a narrative. And it's so funny. I did a report for UNESCO a couple years ago that was just about the Caribbean. And I learned that there are, I think, at least three, if not four, Caribbean countries that claim Christopher Columbus's first arrival. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and that was so eye-opening for me because, of course, you know, even in country, there's like Watlings Island, Cat Island, San Salvador conversations, but then you have Turks and Caicos that also claims it. You have Dominican Republic, you know, so there's all these
Yep.
other
Mm-hmm.
countries that also claim the first arrival. And you know, where is our point of reference for who we are? And this is why a lot of the work that I've been doing now, I've been, you know, I'm currently in Kenya right now having this conversation, you know,
Mm-hmm.
seeing how we integrate indigenous African languages like Amharic and Kiswahili and some of the new educational offerings that we'll have, because there's a wealth of knowledge, there's a wealth of indigenous knowledge that we just have not had access to because we just don't speak the language and there's never been a point of entry. And so I think the more that we can be intentional about the information that we're consuming, the sources of those information, you know, looking at world news from different vantage points, maybe an
Mm-hmm.
Australian news source or a Kenyan news source, other than just the de facto American news sources that we have, I think is really important because at the end of the day, are who we are is framed by the way we see ourselves. And the way we see ourselves is based on the information that we are receiving. And when so much of that is framed by Hollywood, you know, it's a warped perspective. And then so I think that the more that we can diversify the learning nuggets that we're receiving and those sources, you know, and like there's so many different universities in different parts of the world that have YouTube channels that have like there's information out
Mm-hmm.
there. It's just about like how do we intentionally shift our YouTube algorithm so we're
Mm-hmm.
receiving something differently. And it can be
Right.
challenging, but I think it's a practice that we can do, whether it's the Instagram, the TikTok, but however you're consuming information, being intentional about diversifying those sources. And even if it means listening to something that you don't necessarily believe in, because it's important that we don't live in a bubble, you know, like, because the world is not a vacuum. There are different people. We have to learn tolerance. And I think also having a greater Caribbean solidarity, which also means, you know, having greater empathy and understanding for our brothers and sisters in Haiti, because what's happening in Haiti is reflective of what's been happening in West Africa, which is reflective of what's been happening with, the French colonial countries or former colonial countries, and their way of decolonizing has been different from those of the British, but still very similar realities that keep us mentally shackled. So I just think that the best thing that we can do as a people is to be intentional about the information that we're consuming, and then see how we can apply that into visioning a more prosperous, equitable, and safe Bahamas for all.
Awesome. Well, it's been a joy, and we have to bring you back because, there's so much you have opened up that we need to talk about in more depth. And just maybe narrow it down into a corner and just do them in steps and stages. But resilience means how quickly and how efficiently we can bounce back. I think that's something that we should take away. And when we look at that, then we have to prepare to bounce back to be able to be successful. And so when we can do all of that, we can save, because like we said, that when we change governments, we have to bounce back, and there's wastage. Money can be reused for something else. But when we went to COVID and we went shutdowns and we came out, we had to bounce back. How long did that take? We need to make those times shorter so we can have more money available, capital, to do what we need to do. So we thank you. And hopefully that it's not too late in Kenya. It's what? I got 6 here, so it's 2:16. My son will be proud of you because he's nocturnal.
Yay!
Well, my youngest one. The oldest one definitely is not nocturnal.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation, and I look forward to the next one.
Yes, we'll wait that out in the new year. Yeah.
Amazing.
Thank you, folks. Yes. So, folks, we've been watching Something to Think About with Dale Happy Knowles, and we hope that this has been enlightening and thought-provoking, and you can see that there's more opportunities out there. You don't have to just become doctor, lawyer, accountant, engineer, whatever it is that has been traditional. There's space out there. And if you look at the big blue, I think we have something like 80% of our mass is sea. So, if we develop that, then we can have more opportunities to do and create the wealth that we need to create. And so thank you all for joining us. I know you all like to ask questions when you get in these deep conversations and something new, but please, whatever you do, share the show so that more people will benefit as you have benefited today. Next week, we'll have another provocative conversation, and we'll drop a line on that shortly. Enjoy!
Enjoyed the show? Then subscribe to us for more educational and inspirational content. Ring the bell so you never miss a show. Let's change the narrative 242. Enjoyed the show? Then subscribe to us for more educational and inspirational content. Ring the bell so you never miss a show. Let's change the narrative 242.